A palace upheaval occurred, and the throne mysteriously fell on the head of the fourth prince Ye Qinghuai, who had no great ambitions. But only she knew that this country would eventually be handed over to others, because she was an emperor dressed in men's clothing. This day came very quickly. She only sat on the dragon chair for 3 years before being forced to commit suicide by the rebel army at the foot of the city. The leader of the rebel army is none other than Emperor Lu Yanchen, who once made her heart secretly agree. Once again, Ye Qinghuai had no expectations for love and was determined to eradicate the crisis and find a pillar of talent to abdicate the throne as soon as possible. However, in this life, she found that the mountains and rivers were not as clear and peaceful as she thought, and the officials of the humorous were not as loyal and patriotic as she knew. She is considered the emperor, but she is just a bird in a cage. What she sees and hears is just a fairy tale performed for her. The treacherous and sycophantic people lead the way, causing great suffering for the people. Emperor Jing, Ye Qinghuai, is the only hope and belief in the hearts of the people. To wear a crown, one must bear its weight. One day, she had to make a choice between big love and small love. I want to know what your majesty can do for this world. After a moment of contemplation, Ye Qing replied, everything. Keywords of the novel. After Rebirth, the Empress obtains the script of Meiqiang tragedy without a pop-up window. After Rebirth, the Empress obtains the complete text of the script of Meiqiang tragedy to download. After Rebirth, the Empress obtains the latest chapter of the script of Meiqiang tragedy to read. Chapter 1. Closing. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Closing. On the 7th day of the 12th lunar month, in the winter of 2 or 3 years, the cold wind rustled and the black clouds pressed against the city. Xingjing, Hall of Supreme Harmony. At this moment, the magnificent hall was empty, and there was a faint flame outside. The sound of close combat and mournful screams were blocked by the heavy palace gates, making it stuffy and difficult to hear clearly. Tung oil and a bloody smell overflowed in, wreaking havoc in the chilly air. The rebels have entered the city. The young emperor, dressed in imperial robes, sat alone on a high throne, with a straight body. She clasped her hands in front, leaning on a sword with a deadly aura. Under the jade flute lay a torn scroll, and on the cover of the black background with cloud patterns, there was a powerful line of ink. Appeal to Ye Qinghuai and proclaim to the world. The commander-in-chief of the rebel army, Lu Yanchen, issued a proclamation to the world, and it was she who launched a campaign against her. Ye Qinghuai, the 7th emperor of dying. Ye Qinghuai stared at the vermilion-painted palace gate at the end of the main hall and suddenly thought of a question. How will future history books comment on her? I believe he must be a dog emperor full of evil, Ye Qinghuai thought to himself. Killing his brother, killing his father, usurping the throne, torturing loyalty and righteousness, and slaughtering the people are all indispensable. As stated in the proclamation. This is in line with the image of a foolish ruler who forces the people to rise up. Ye Qinghuai has read that proclamation, with sharp words and words like knives, which made people and gods angry. If it weren't for the object of the condemnation, even she couldn't help but curse along with, the traitor shall be executed, and then join the army of condemnation with her sword. It's truly Mr. Lu's literary talent. His brushstrokes are shocking. Unfortunately, they are a series of lies, commented Ye Qinghuai. She didn't acknowledge any of the accusations in the proclamation. From the moment I remember, Ye Qinghuai knew that he had taken on the identity of his twin brothers who died young. One mistake in the palace was to commit the crime of deceiving the emperor and have his entire family executed. His life was like walking on thin ice. For the throne, she has always avoided it, avoiding it as far as possible. She only hopes that when she reaches the age of coronation, she can leave the capital on her own, stay away from the palace, this place of trouble, and take her mother to live a comfortable life in the frontier town's fiefdom. If it weren't for the decline of the fathers and sons heirs, and the fierce fighting among several brothers, a palace coup would have resulted in the death of 4 princes and 3 others. This throne would never have fallen on her head under any circumstances. Ye Qinghuai was able to survive the brutal palace upheaval unscathed, thanks entirely to her low-key handling over the years. She was so low-key that when everyone was vying for the throne, she almost forgot about the existence of the first prince like her. Cranes and clams compete, but the fisherman benefits. But unfortunately, she is a fisherman who doesn't want to fish. It's really fate that manipulates people. Rivers and mountains fall from the sky, and Ye Qinghuai knows that he cannot be the eternal emperor who is remembered in history. He only seeks to guard the mountains and rivers well and live a peaceful life. She personally took the country name Sueha, which means, year after year peace. May the grand scenery be peaceful every year, and may she herself be peaceful every year. Unfortunately, fate did not meet people's wishes, and once her feminine identity was revealed, everything changed. Ye Qinghuai consciously reigned for 3 years, with no achievements or mistakes. If there must be a point of fault, the only thing she did wrong was to show a little bit of unease towards her teacher, to the point of revealing her daughter's family identity to him. 20-year-old and exceptionally talented scholar from the Taiqing Pavilion, Emperor Lu Yanchen. For this young imperial teacher, besides her admiration for her children, she also has an indescribable admiration. In her life, she never wore red makeup, nor did she apply makeup. She read books of sages, learned how to govern the country, learned how to bow and shoot eagles, and cultivated how to help the world. The only bit of shyness in her daughter's family was given to Lu Yanchen. However, it was her untimely teenage sentiment that ruined the century-long history of the scenery. Her trust and honesty did not earn Lu Yanchen's green eyes, but they were exchanged for a proclamation, causing the country to fall and the family to perish. The heavy palace gate of the Hall of Supreme Harmony was pushed open, and a cold wind swept into the main hall with a bloody smell. A man in black armor strode into the hall. He held a sword in one hand and a human head in the other. His black eyes were cold and bright, covered in bloodstains but unable to conceal the charm of hunting. Ye Qinghuai's heart trembled. Not seen in a year, she cursed Lu Yanchen countless times in her heart, hated him countless times, and made up her mind to sever ties with him. But now, just a glance at him from afar has turned all her previous efforts into nothing. Her heart still beats for him. Even though he raised his army against her and verbally criticized her in his proclamation, even though he was like a Shura at the moment, he was followed by a dark and oppressive rebel army. Lu Yanchen walked to the foot of the Jade Pavilion and threw the human head down the steps. Ye Qinghuai glanced at the head assistant Chen Yuanxi. The old minister of the 3 dynasties had disheveled hair on his temples and refused to close his eyes when he died. However, Lu Yanchen didn't even look at the head. He looked up at Ye Qinghuai on the throne, his expression resolute and stubborn. Then, he sheathed his sword, took out a scroll of documents from his pocket, lifted it high, and half knelt down towards Ye Qinghuai. I have drafted a decree of self-punishment for your majesty, requesting your majesty to declare this to the world and abdicate to the wise. I can ensure your majesty's stability for the rest of his life. Ye Qinghuai didn't answer him. Her mouth curved straight, and her grip on the sword tightened. She stood up and dragged the heavy sword weighing over 10 pounds down the stairs. The main hall was silent, and only the sound of the sword blade passing over the golden steps could be heard. She walked up to Lu Yanchen and asked, "Why?" Lu Yanchen's figure seemed to pause. Ye Qinghuai increased his voice and asked again, "Why?" Lu Yanchen lowered his head a little further and said, "Your Majesty, the Forbidden Army has surrendered, the Chen party has been subdued, and the great momentum of the scene has been exhausted. Please comply with the timing and make a decision as soon as possible. I asked you why. Why did it happen to be you? After 3 years as a teacher and student, I asked myself how I treated you well and treated you like a teacher and father. How could you raise this anti-flag? Sir, how can you feel at ease?" She said the 4 words, "like a teacher like a father," and saw that Lu Yanchen's body visibly stiffened for a moment. His stiffness raised a glimmer of hope in Ye Qinghuai's heart. She thought to herself, it seems that Lu Yanchen's conscience is still alive, and there is still a trace of the old teacher-student relationship. She glanced at the torn half of the proclamation and asked, "Sir, look up at me. Tell me, in your heart, do I really feel as dazed as you wrote in your proclamation?" When the rebels entered the city, she was reluctant to leave, just to ask him this sentence in person. She wanted to know whether this proclamation was what he had in mind or just an excuse to raise troops. Lu Yanchen stood up straight and looked up at Ye Qinghuai. His black eyes were like an eternal night, and he couldn't see the bottom. "If your majesty were a wise ruler, how could there be today? Since ancient times, only a foolish ruler has been overthrown, and no wise ruler has been overthrown." His words were like a pot of cold water in winter, suffocating Ye Qinghuai. She persisted and asked again, "If I were to say that I have never killed my brother, killed my father, or entrusted the heavenly decree, and that the Tianmen incident was not my intention, would you trust me, sir?" Lu Yanchen furrowed his brows slightly and replied, "Your Majesty, this matter has come to an end. If I believe you or not, what can I do? Please show mercy to all the people and issue a decree to restore peace to the world." Ye Qinghuai let out a faint sigh. She always knew that Lu Yanchen never wanted to lie, so when he couldn't nod, he always avoided talking. He said that just because he didn't believe her. He truly hates and detests her, as he wrote in his proclamation. Ye Qinghuai let out a light sigh. She had always wanted to find an answer, but now that she has found it, it can be considered a matter of seeking benevolence, without any worries. She picked up the draft edict that Lu Yanchen had been holding and flipped through it. The edict read that she was not worthy of her position and wished to abdicate to Lu Yanchen, hoping that he would treat officials and the people well. "If I abdicate and pass on the throne to you as you wish, how do you plan to deal with me?" Lu Yanchen's eyes seemed to brighten as he said, "I will create a place in the palace for your majesty to spend the rest of his life here." "I understand now. What you want is not only the throne, but also the legitimacy of this throne." Ye Qinghuai nodded, "You think well. If it weren't for my self-incriminating edict, it would probably take you a lot of time to reorganize the court, eliminate old officials, and pacify the feudal lords." After speaking, Ye Qinghuai smiled and raised her hand to throw the paper grass edict high. With a wave of her sword, she cut the edict in half in the air. As she stood up with her sword in hand, the soldiers behind Lu Yanchen all moved in unison, facing Ye Qinghuai with their swords and bows, drawing arrows. As long as Ye Qinghuai is slightly unfavorable to Lu Yanchen, these people will immediately make her head fall. "Stop it!" Lu Yanchen whispered and stopped the general behind him with his eyes. The general ate his eye knife and immediately withdrew his sword, guarding on the side. The soldiers behind him also followed his movements. Ye Qinghuai sighed in her heart. What a prohibition! She withdrew her gaze and breathed a sigh of relief, then smiled at Lu Yanchen and said, "I can't let you go as you please, otherwise wouldn't I be ashamed of the reputation of the foolish ruler? Your Majesty, swords have no eyes. Don't be impulsive. As long as you abdicate and give up your position, you will never step out of the harem again. I am willing to protect your safety for the rest of your life with my family and life." Lu Yanchen looked at the Emperor's sword dragon abyss in her hand with some caution, her voice surprisingly panicked. That sword was very heavy, even holding it in hand felt difficult, and Ye Qinghuai didn't know how he had just lifted such a heavy sword. "It seems that in Mr. S script, I not only want to lose my ancestors' territory, but also become the enemy's forbidden territory," Ye Qinghuai joked, as if talking about something unrelated to himself. Unexpectedly, this joke from her made Lu Yanchen's expression change greatly. He stared at Ye Qinghuai, with a worried and joyful look in his eyes, and a dangerous aura of anticipation. "Lu Yanchen, do you know what I fear the most in my life? I am not afraid of life or death, nor do I care about the illusions written by historians. What I fear the most in my life is being a caged bird." Ye Qinghuai turned around and walked slowly for 2 steps, with his back to Lu Yanchen. He looked up at the throne and said, "Sir once taught me that the world of our Ye ancestors was obtained on horseback. The children of the Ye family have always died standing, not kneeling to live. Qinghuai cannot continue the legacy of our ancestors, but he also does not want to smear the lintel of the Ye family." Ye Qinghuai suddenly raised her hand, and the dragon Yuan sword cut into her neck. Without hesitation, she neatly pulled the sword, cutting off all her blood vessels, and a 3-foot-high mist of blood rose from the edge of the sword. Qinghuai. The voice of Lu Yanchen echoed behind her, with a rare sense of fear and anxiety. Ye Qinghuai fell into a warm embrace, one she had longed for so long. Lu Yanchen held her tightly, with one hand pressed against her neck, as if trying to stop the gushing blood. "Where's the military doctor? Tao Erlong. Go call the military doctor. Go quickly." He turned his head and roared angrily. Ye Qinghuai had never seen him look like this before. She saw the collapse and panic of the building in his eyes. Ye Qinghuai suddenly let go. In his lifetime, seeing Lu Yanchen so nervous about himself, even if he had ulterior motives, Ye Qinghuai felt that death was without regret. She took out a sealed testament from her arms and smiled, saying, "Sir, don't panic. Before you came, I had already made a testament to abdicate and passed on the throne to you. When the 6 old ministers saw this testament, they would naturally submit to you. From now on, the world and the people will be entrusted to you. I am not a good emperor and have caused the people to suffer. Sir, please don't let them down anymore." She stuffed the testament into Lu Yanchen's arms, held his hand tightly, and pushed it hard. It was truly like Sheng entrusted to a lonely person. Heavy. Ye Qinghuai's vision darkened, and she saw Lu Yanchen's mouth twitching back and forth, seeming to be saying something, but she couldn't hear clearly. There was a sharp ringing in her ears. "Whether it's hard to hear clearly," Ye Qinghuai smiled. She had nothing to ask of him and didn't want to hear anything from him anymore. She struggled to turn her head in the arms of Lu Yanchen, and finally looked at the majestic and cold throne. She murmured, "The heavenly family has no father and son, brothers are on the wall. Yes, the heavenly family doesn't even have family ties, but I still hope that my master will give me sincerity. It's ridiculous that I am young and inexperienced." In Ye Qinghuai's scattered vision, it seemed to see the gloomy winter sky like a lead grey curtain, heavily pressing on the top of the palace city. Large snowflakes slowly drifted down, as if silent dust was drifting in the sky. The last emperor of Daying, Ye Qinghuai, closed his eyes in the arms of her teacher, Lu Yanchen, crying and laughing, ending his short and absurd life. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Rebirth. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Rebirth. Twilight fades, morning rises, 10,000 opportunities await management. Twilight fades, morning rises, 10,000 opportunities await management. Twilight fades, morning rises, 10,000 opportunities await management. In the sharp voice of the eunuch, Ye Qinghuai suddenly opened his eyes. She bounced up on the bed and instinctively touched her neck. Smooth as before, without blood. Ye Qinghuai looked at her lush and jade-white 10 fingers, stunned and unable to speak. "Your Majesty is in a nightmare." A familiar voice sounded beside her bed. Ye Qinghuai looked up and saw Aunt Fanghua looking at her kindly, holding a hot and translucent handkerchief in her hand. She leaned in to help wipe the sweat off her forehead. "Your Majesty's sweat is so strong that you can't wear this middle garment anymore. I'll bring you another one." After saying that, she put down her handkerchief and turned around to look for clothes. Ye Qinghuai grabbed her wrist tightly and didn't let go. Aunt Fanghua felt pain and turned around to see Ye Qinghuai staring at her incredulously, like a frightened little beast. Aunt Fanghua gently patted Ye Qinghuai's hand and sat down by the bed, holding her in her arms. She patted her back like a child and whispered, "Your Majesty is not afraid. I am here, not going anywhere. I am guarding your majesty, and your majesty doesn't need to be afraid of anything. When the late emperor was still in his secret residence, Aunt Fanghua was a maid who married Empress Ye Qinghuai to the crown prince's mansion. Ye Qinghuai was the only person in the entire harem who knew her daughter's identity. When Ye Qinghuai was young, she was particularly clingy to her. She had to accompany her to sleep every night, otherwise she would cry and make noise, making the entire eastern palace restless. Even her mother couldn't help it. At that time, Aunt Fanghua coaxed her like this, and she could calm down in no time. She tried it repeatedly. "Auntie." This familiar and warm embrace made Ye Qinghuai's eyes ache. "Isn't Aunt Fanghua dead?" After Ye Qinghuai's identity as a woman was exposed, the entire court criticized her mother, Empress Dowager Jingmin, deeply, believing that she was causing trouble in the palace and deceiving the emperor. They requested that her title be revoked and her body be moved out of the imperial tomb. Aunt Fanghua, with her hair draped and bare feet, went to the hall to express her feelings, claiming that everything was her idea. Unfortunately, in the end, not only did Empress Jingmin fail to be saved, but even Aunt Fanghua herself fell in and was whipped to death in front of the palace. "You're still alive. Am I dreaming? Silly child, are you still talking in your dreams? Isn't the servant here all right?" She patted Ye Qinghuai's hand and said, "I'm going to get you clothes and change clothes. Today is the first morning court after your majesty's personal rule. You need to be mentally and energetic." Ye Qinghuai's body stiffened. Pro-politics. "Auntie, is today the first day of the 12th lunar month in the year Sui and Nian. "Yes, your majesty, what's going on? Is it really a nightmare?" "I'm fine, auntie, go get the clothes." Watching Aunt Fanghua walk away, Ye Qinghuai sighed and wondered, what's going on? How did I go back a year ago? On the first day of the 12th lunar month in the first and second years of the lunar calendar, it was the day when she turned 16 and took power. A day she will never forget. It was on this day that Lu Yanchen hinted to Ye Qinghuai in class, using ancient and modern terms, that he would establish a concubine. Ye Qinghuai felt aggrieved and resentful, and immediately told him the identity of the woman. Fortunately, nothing has happened yet. At this time, no one knew about her daughter's body, and the flames of war had not yet ignited. Everything was possible. Ye Qinghuai's mind was spinning rapidly. In her past life, she was able to achieve national downfall and family downfall within a short year, partly due to the leakage of her feminine identity, and partly due to the change of the Qingtian Gate. In February of the third year, the following day after the release of the Chunwei report, students from the School of Literature jointly wrote a letter, believing that there was insider information about the current Chunwei report and demanding that the governor of Jingzhou and the Ministry of Justice thoroughly investigate. The following month, the Ministry of Justice determined that Chunwei's fraud was a false rumor and thus closed the case. However, the students of the literary school did not agree with this conclusion. Hundreds of students petitioned outside Qingtian Gate, requesting the court to investigate the matter again. The angry students did not wait for an answer from the court, but waited for the military suppression of the Jiangyi Imperial Guard. All the students involved were executed on the street, and blood splattered on the Vermilion Gate. The gate outside Qingtian on that day was like a human purgatory, extremely tragic, known as the Qingtian Gate incident in history. This matter is like a stone thrown into the water of this pond, causing ripples in various states and counties. Under the rule of Dying, there were 4 rebellions against the flag, and the flames of war grew stronger and stronger. It was not until Lu Yanchen's troops rose to Yunzhou that Dying's strength was completely burned down. Even today, Ye Qinghuai is still unaware of the true situation of this matter. She only remembered one day when she was studying in the Wenxuan Hall, the commander of the Imperial Guards came with the Minister of War to request an order, stating that there was a disturbance outside the palace gate and requesting the mobilization of the Imperial Guards in the capital to deter them. Ye Qinghuai briefly asked, but did not realize it was inappropriate, and then nodded. At that time, she did not know that the so-called people were unarmed students from literary schools, nor did she know that behind their disturbances was the Qinghuai fraud case, let alone that the situation would evolve to such an extent. What is your Majesty thinking? He's so lost in thought. Aunt Fanghua walked over holding a bright yellow undershirt, interrupting Ye Qinghuai's contemplation. She regained her senses, smiled at Aunt Fanghua, stood up, and let her wrap her chest and dress herself. Ye Qinghuai is tall, and Aunt Fanghua is half of her height. She looks down at Aunt Fanghua skillfully taking care of her dragon robe. Thinking of her tragic death in her past life, she feels a bit unbearable. Let's start over again. Even if she can't hold on to the country in this lifetime, at least she must hold on to the people around her. Auntie, if one day I abdicate and travel to rivers and mountains, will Auntie still follow me? Aunt Fanghua was slightly taken aback and asked, how did your Majesty have such thoughts? If I were to sit in this seat, I would never have a son and a half daughters in my life. This land will eventually be handed over to someone, so it would be better to let it go as soon as possible. I can still go out of the palace and enjoy myself for a few years. Aunt Fanghua didn't take it seriously. She took care of Ye Qinghuai's dragon robe while laughing. Your Majesty is someone who wants to govern personally. How could you be so childish and always think about going out to play? Ye Qinghuai knew she hadn't taken it seriously, so she sighed and said, I was born and raised in this palace wall, and even after ascending to the throne, I haven't stepped out of the palace gate for half a step. Just thinking about it, can't I? Aunt Fanghua finally straightened Ye Qinghuai's collar and showed a satisfied smile, saying, okay. If your Majesty is going to abdicate and leave the palace one day, she will give me a decree to guard the imperial tomb. I want to spend the rest of my life with my mother in the imperial tomb. The Empress in her mouth is naturally Empress Dowager Jingmin, the mother of Ye Qinghuai. Ye Qinghuai seemed surprised that she would have such a resolution, and couldn't help but be taken aback before saying, okay. Hall of Supreme Harmony. The civil and military officials stood in separate ranks, with two auxiliary ministers standing at the head of the courtiers. The first deputy Qin Yuanxi and the second deputy Gu Shihai. When the late emperor returned to heaven, Ye Qinghuai was only 14 years old and could not yet govern personally. She is still young and has never ventured out of the palace to open a mansion, nor has she ever been involved in seizing the throne. Therefore, she has no staff, and her maternal grandfather is only a fourth-grade junior supervisor of the imperial household. Her family background is not prominent. The late emperor was concerned about the power of her relatives after her marriage, as well as the influence of powerful officials. Therefore, he appointed two auxiliary ministers to her in order to balance the power of the two sides. The two auxiliary ministers left to her by her father can be said to be the backbone of the court, which saved Ye Qinghuai a lot of trouble. In the early dynasties before she took power, Ye Qinghuai mostly sat on the throne and listened to the court's affairs. The courtiers were openly speaking to her, but in reality, they were reporting to the two assistant ministers. Although she has already performed the grand ceremony of personal governance, it is difficult for her to change the habit of being 100 officials for a while. Ye Qinghuai didn't pay much attention, as the court officials were capable and she enjoyed being idle. At this moment, she was sitting on the throne, holding her head with one hand, watching as Shofu and Sifu argued endlessly about the candidates for the New Year's Day. They had always regarded each other as their number one political enemy, but who could have imagined that both of them would eventually die at the hands of Lu Yanchen? The Qingtian Gate incident is still easy to resolve, as long as she does not mobilize the guards, it will not happen. What is truly difficult to deal with is Lu Yanchen. The 50,000 rebels in Yunzhou are well-trained and well-equipped, far from ordinary peasant uprisings. Lu Yanchen comes from a family of merchants, so it is impossible for him to have the ability to support troops. Behind him, there must be another expert. Ye Qinghuai was pondering in her heart how to deal with Lu Yanchen during her afternoon studies when she suddenly heard a loud report, "My lord, the Sincerity wenching, I have submitted this report to your Majesty. 3 days ago, the Ministry of Justice detained Wen Xiaowu School for offering wine on charges of false words, which is not in accordance with the regulations. Wen Xiaowu School was established by the founder of our dynasty, and the position of offering wine is the same as that of the 3 princes. The arrest of offering wine requires your Majesty's personal approval, but the Ministry of Justice only detained people in prison based on a draft edict drafted by the Taiqing Pavilion. As the censor, I find it difficult to sit idly by and hope your Majesty will personally adjudicate this case. After speaking, he knelt down on the ground and knocked his head heavily. Your Majesty did not personally govern at that time, and this matter was decided by the Assistant Minister. The Taiqing Pavilion proposed a decree, how could it not comply with the regulations? The defendant filed a complaint, and the Minister of Justice, Du Jing, immediately stepped forward to clarify. Last month His Majesty had already held a grand ceremony of personal governance, so it should not be decided by the Assistant Minister. It should be personally approved by His Majesty's Imperial Pen. Your Majesty has only been in power for the first day today. Perhaps Lord Li hasn't woken up and is confused, has he? Your Majesty's days of personal governance should be calculated according to the grand ceremony of personal governance. Mr. Zhang was also a leader in the palace examination at that time, and he didn't even know such basic etiquette. Or is there any reason why the Ministry of Justice must urgently detain the Wen School's sacrificial wine? Du Jing snorted coldly and said, the Ministry of Justice naturally acts according to the law. I have heard that Lord Li was a proud disciple of sacrificial wine in his early years. If Lord Li insists on such a small matter, shouldn't it be a case of using public service for personal gain? The two of them had a few rounds of verbal altercations, but a voice interrupted them. Li Wenqing, who did you say the Ministry of Justice detained? With this inquiry from Ye Qinghuai, the entire court suddenly fell silent. The civil and military officials in the entire court looked at her in surprise, as if no one had expected her to make a sound of inquiry. Ye Qinghuai was not surprised. She has always been in court with only ears and no mouth, rarely asking questions. She was used to the courtiers arguing, often more difficult than household chores, and she didn't want to get involved. But this time it's different. There are still 2 months left before the Spring Festival, and the Qingtian Gate incident arose as a result. At this time, Chaos Hang had an argument over the matter of the literary school, so she had to ask more questions. Without waiting for Li Wenqing to answer, Gu Shihai took the lead and replied, Your Majesty, it is Wang Li Song, the sacrificial wine of the School of Literature. He openly criticized the court system in class and even wrote an article called, Wu Ho Luan, to satirize the past and present, which was included in the curriculum. This incident is harmful to education, and the Ministry of Justice took him down immediately to prevent him from further deceiving the public. After listening to this, Ye Qinghuai pondered and said, Gu Gu is thoughtful, but what Li Wenqing said is also reasonable. Without rules, there is no harmony, and the etiquette and laws established by our ancestors cannot be neglected. Alright, the Ministry of Justice will arrange a meeting to review this Wang Li Song, and I will attend as a bystander. After the meeting is concluded, I will add a decree of personal approval. As soon as she said this, the air in the court froze for a moment. What's wrong? What's wrong? Ye Qinghuai asked. Your Majesty is wise, and I am a humble minister. Gu Shihai knelt down first, and the Minister of Justice, Du Jing, was his disciple. He knelt down to receive the decree, and Du Jing followed suit to receive it. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Portrait. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 Portrait. After lunch, it was Ye Qinghuai's daily class time. If it were usual, this would be the happiest time of her day. But now it's different from the past. Ye Qinghuai is very anxious, and on the way to Wenshuan Hall, she walks slowly. She hasn't figured out how to face Lu Yanchen yet. Ye Qinghuai believed that before his death in his previous life, he had already cleared his grudges and had no love or hate from then on, only wanting to have no connection with him again. So much so that when she first woke up, she didn't think of Lu Yanchen for the first time, only thinking about why she had to be reborn. She had neither the obsession of starting over and continuing her relationship with him, nor the grudge of never dying together. She has nothing else to ask of him. But how to deal with him now is indeed a difficult problem. After revealing her feminine identity to Lu Yanchen in her previous life, Lu Yanchen wrote a letter to Dingyu and returned home the following month. When Ye Qinghuai saw his dictionary, his people were already far away in Yunzhou. Ye Qinghuai scrutinized in his heart, realizing that there were only two paths to his current plan. Either he is about to be killed, or he is imprisoned in Xinjing. Whether it's killing or circling, we must first figure out where his 50,000 rebel troops come from, otherwise even if we capture him, it may be in vain. It was in such a complex mood that Ye Qinghuai met Lu Yanchen in the study. Lu Yanchen, dressed in indigo court attire, sat upright by the desk, with a scroll of books spread out on the table. His fair and slender hands with distinct joints occasionally flipped through the pages of the book. Upon hearing Ye Qinghuai's arrival, he turned his head and gave her a peaceful look before getting up and saying, "Your Majesty is half a quarter late today." Ye Qinghuai felt his heart pounding like a deer, and the burning pain on the side of his neck after committing suicide seemed to be an instinctive reaction of his body. Damn it, what about a settled relationship without love or hate? She cursed herself in her heart. On his face, he appeared calm and indifferent. He bowed to Lu Yanchen and walked straight to the main table, sitting down. He said, "I have something to delay. Please punish me, sir." Lu Yanchen's teaching has always been strict, and any mistakes will be punished. As expected by Ye Qinghuai, today's lecture is the same as in his previous life, which is about the Emperor of Shihua over 600 years ago. He fell in love with a wet nurse who was 10 years older than him, to the extent that his harem was empty and he favored only one person. In the end, his offspring withered and he was usurped by his own imperial uncle. Ye Qinghuai only had close contact with Aunt Fanghua in the palace, and only allowed her to serve her in matters such as sleeping, bathing, and changing clothes. Therefore, there were some rumors in the palace earlier. In his past life, Lu Yanchen used the sarcastic advice of Emperor Shihua to persuade Ye Qinghuai to become a concubine as soon as possible. Ye Qinghuai was so angry that he blushed and even told him that he was a woman, but Lu Yanchen didn't believe it. Ye Qinghuai held his hand and pressed it on his chest before he believed it. Starting over in this lifetime, Ye Qinghuai's mentality has become much more stable, let alone in her early days when she had already considered countermeasures. After Lu Yanchen finished speaking the entire text, Ye Qinghuai asked directly, "If I want to establish a queen, who do you think is suitable for me to establish?" She countered with an army and instead stopped Lu Yanchen. Seeing that Lu Yanchen remained silent, Ye Qinghuai asked again, "Chen Gu Lao's eldest granddaughter is 20 this year, and Gu Gu Lao's legitimate daughter is 16 this year. Who do you think is suitable for me to appoint, sir? This matter concerns the state, and I am only a scholar of the Taiqing Pavilion, so I dare not trespass." He saluted. Ye Qinghuai glanced at him and sighed, "The two of them balance each other, and only then can the court and the public be at peace. Therefore, I am not the one who stands now. Since you dare not trespass, I will not bring up this matter again. I am not Shihua, and I will not do such a foolish thing." After Ye Qinghuai finished speaking, she glanced at Lu Yanchen's face and saw that he was no longer worried. Ye Qinghuai breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that her statement had touched him. Sure enough, Lu Yanchen pondered for a moment and said, "Your Majesty has already made plans, so I won't say much more. But please remember, the rivers and mountains are of great importance, and don't be blinded by wild flowers." The random flowers in his mouth naturally alluded to Aunt Fanghua, and Ye Qinghuai couldn't hear it. It is said that one day is a teacher, and one life is a father. Although Lu Yanchen is only 8 years older than her, since becoming her husband, she has become more mature in front of her, and her speech and behavior have become more like that of an elder. Ye Qinghuai looked at Lu Yanchen's sharp and handsome nose and eyes, and smiled bitterly in his heart, saying, if he knew he was this chaotic flower, he didn't know what to think. She bowed and replied, Sir's teachings, I will keep them in my heart. That's all for today's homework. Your Majesty will copy and recite the entire second chapter of Qingde Yao Lu once, and then the class can start. He looked at the sky outside and said, it's still early. Has Your Majesty finished last month's strategy? I will review it here. When Lu Yanchen gave a lecture, he asked Ye Qinghuai to write a strategy essay every month, and Quan Dang would summarize his studies. Ye Qinghuai can no longer remember what she wrote in her game theory homework a year ago, but her homework has always been placed in the same place. So she looked at a corner of the bookshelf and said, it's all on the bookshelf. Sir, please check it yourself. After speaking, she opened the book Qingde Yao Lu on her own and began copying it. Lu Yanchen took a stack of her homework and reviewed it on the next case. The sun slanted westward, and the Wenshuan Hall gradually cooled down. The sunlight slanted through a corner of the gate. The hall is quiet, with occasional sounds of flipping through books, creating a peaceful learning atmosphere for teachers and students. Qingde Yao Lu is a governing strategy written by Emperor Shengzu, and Chapter 2 discusses people's livelihood and finance. Ye Qinghuai has already finished learning this guidebook in his past life, and can recite the entire text fluently. Now, he can recite it with ease, and in less than half an hour, he will finish it as soon as he sees it. At this moment, Ye Qinghuai heard the voice of Lu Yanchen. Is this portrait made by Your Majesty? His voice had a hint of coolness, appearing somewhat distant. Ye Qinghuai lifted her head and saw a portrait sandwiched between her homework, with a beautiful blue brush outlining a handsome man. She took a deep breath and suddenly one head turned into two. The man depicted in the painting is none other than Lu Yanchen. The painter depicted him with a graceful and charming demeanor, full of emotions on paper. In the upper left corner, there was also a line of beautiful small regular script inscribed. There are trees and branches in the mountains, and the heart is pleasing to the Lord, but the Lord does not know. Whose handwriting is not Ye Qinghuai's. After the rebellion of Lu Yanchen in her previous life, she burned this painting to the point where she completely forgot its existence after being reborn. She worked on this painting for a whole month, personally selecting the best paper and ink, and repeatedly revising more than 10 drafts before finally finishing the painting. The portrayal of Lu Yanchen in the painting is lifelike, but more vivid than himself. Ye Qinghuai once cherished this painting very much. She dared not show any disrespect in front of Lu Yanchen, so she could only entrust her infatuation with this portrait. The paintings contain the inexplicable joy and loss of her teenage years, which are her secrets, her weaknesses, but also her treasures. At this moment, this secret and unspoken thought lies naked between the teacher and student. If reborn more than once, Ye Qing would hate to commit suicide on the spot and start over again. Lu Yanchen looked at her with a complex expression. She had never seen so many expressions on his iceberg-like face in her 2 lifetimes, more vivid than what she had painted. Ye Qinghuai's gaze wandered back and forth between the paper portrait and Lu Yanchen. She quickly got up and walked to Lu Yanchen's desk, wanting to retrieve the painting. But he didn't want Lu Yanchen to clench tightly and not let go. His gaze never left Ye Qinghuai's face for a moment. The quality of the painting paper personally selected by Ye Qinghuai is excellent, very resilient, and even in the secret tug between the two, it remains intact. My poor work, it's not pleasing to the eye. Don't tarnish the gentleman's eyes, Ye Qing smiled with a guilty heart. She implied that she had acknowledged that the painting was her own work, and when Lu Yanchen received the answer she wanted, she suddenly let go. Ye Qinghuai quickly took back the portrait and returned to her desk, pressing it under a stack of books before lifting her head and awkwardly smiling at Lu Yanchen. It's just a small portrait, sir. Don't worry. Lu Yanchen didn't answer, still staring at Ye Qinghuai for a moment. Ye Qinghuai was a bit flustered when he saw her, so he had to smile again and lower his head to continue copying her homework. After a stick of incense, Ye Qinghuai finally finished copying. Her mind was buzzing, not knowing what she had copied. She put down her pen, wiped the sweat off her forehead with her hand, but dared not look up at Lu Yanchen. Your Majesty's unwillingness to enrich the harem was not due to the West China, but rather due to Dong Gong's reasons. Lu Yanchen sighed for a long time. Dong Gong was the male favorite of the most famous sleeveless emperor in history, Emperor Ai of Chu, Dong Bai. Their deeds can be said to be timeless, providing many materials for folk literary and artistic creation. Lu Yanchen stood up and walked to the hall, paying a great salute to Ye Qinghuai. He bowed to the ground and said, "The decline of Chu began with mourning for the emperor. This matter concerns the country's sovereignty. I hope your Majesty will remember the country and not imitate the mourning emperor of the previous dynasty. Although I am not Duke Dong, I have done the same thing as Duke Dong, and I will never be exempt from death. I am worthy of being an imperial teacher, and I request your Majesty to punish me for the crime of causing harm to the country." He spoke with righteous words and felt heartbroken, but Ye Qinghuai felt even more headache-stricken. What is the crime of endangering the country? That will be beheaded. He can plead for this crime, but Ye Qinghuai cannot cure it. An imperial teacher, a scholar of the Taiqing Pavilion, was suddenly beheaded. What should be written in the edict to the court and the public? Do you want to write about him flattering the troublemaker? What was lost was not only Lu Yanchen's life, but also the royal face. Moreover, Ye Qinghuai was not confident that he could be a killer against him. Your words are too heavy, sir. It's my absurdity, not my fault. If you want to punish me, I will bear the brunt. Ye Qinghuai advised with kind words. Nurturing or not teaching is the fault of the father. Teaching is not strict, and the teacher is lazy. Your Majesty is young and has an unstable mind, which is the responsibility of the minister for not being able to guide well. Please forgive me, Your Majesty. He knelt on the ground like a corrupt old minister, seemingly determined to wait for Ye Qinghuai to forgive me. Ye Qinghuai has always been the most intolerant of Lu Yanchen's stubborn appearance. She stood up and angrily said, "That's right, I like you. I just like Longyang. But if I kill you, will Longyang be bad? If I kill you, there will be Zhao Yanchen and Li Yanchen. There are so many men in the world, and I will still like them. What's the use of killing you?" After Ye Qinghuai finished speaking, she saw that Lu Yanchen's body was noticeably stiff. Based on Ye Qinghuai's understanding of him, she knew that this was a sign of Lu Yanchen's anger. Seeing him like this, Ye Qinghuai was a bit hesitant, worried that she had said too much. After a short moment, Lu Yanchen raised his head and asked, "What do your Majesty think should be done to punish me?" He spoke earnestly, looked worried, and there was a hint of expectation in his eyes that Ye Qinghuai couldn't understand. Ye Qing hesitated for a moment and said solemnly, "Your Excellency is right. If you don't teach strictly, your teacher will fall. Since your Excellency says that my character is uncertain, I will punish you and lead me back to the right path." End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Sincerity. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The source has no content or has errors. Chapter 5. Declaration of illness. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Declaration of illness. After dinner, Ye Qinghuai stayed in the Wenshuan Hall until late at night. At this time, she is either painting or playing chess. The palace people know that the emperor likes to be quiet while painting and playing chess, so there is only one eunuch, Li Baoquan, who is in charge of the imperial palace, serving in the palace. Today, Ye Qinghuai also sent out Li Baoquan. When he was about to leave, Ye Qinghuai instructed him to extinguish the incense in the three-legged porcelain incense burner. The scent of agarwood quickly faded, accompanied by the drowsy warmth that dissipated. Ye Qinghuai was lost in thought as she looked at the painted paper spread out on the desk. The ink on the paper was not dyed, and there was Li Baochuan's polished ink beside the paperweight. In the winter chill, the ink quickly dried up, but she still had no intention of picking up a pen. Ye Qinghuai had no intention of painting today. She repeatedly recalled the words she had said to Lu Yanchen during the day in her mind, carefully considering the words, hoping to read some clues of rebellion from them. But even with all her recollections, she felt that Lu Yanchen was a completely loyal minister in both speech and behavior, especially his expectations and trust in Ye Qinghuai, which did not seem to be put on. If it had to be said that there was something unusual about him, Ye Qing pondered and only thought of two things. Firstly, Lu Yanchen was dissatisfied with the atmosphere of the court. Secondly, the friendship between Lu Yanchen and Wen School's sacrificial wine may not be as shallow as he claimed. But these 2 points alone are far from enough to make him raise the banner of rebellion. To be fair, during the 3 years when Lu Yanchen took charge of the Wenshuan Hall, his loyalty to Ye Qinghuai can be described as commendable, and he kept his heart to heart. It was precisely because of this that in the previous life, Ye Qinghuai hesitated to believe the name of the landing banquet dust on the paper proclamation. What have I done to make him hold such a grudge? Is it the Qingtian Gate incident? But with Lu Yanchen's understanding of me, how could he not guess what was not done by me? Are there any details that I have overlooked? Ye Qing was lost in thought and couldn't understand. Your Majesty, it's late at night. Please prioritize the dragon body. Li Baochuan's voice came from outside the door, listening from a distance through the palace gate. Ye Qinghuai rubbed his forehead, sighed, stood up, pulled out the blank canvas, frowned, and looked at it again before throwing it aside. She pushed open the door, and Li Baoquan, who was waiting outside, immediately approached her and quickly tied a cloak around her. Ye Qinghuai stepped onto the chariot and heard Li Baochuan's sharp voice ringing behind him. Drive back to the palace. The next morning in the morning, Ye Qinghuai asked about the trial of Wang Li Song. The Ministry of Justice stated that the Dali Temple had arranged it properly and submitted the trial process and the list of jurors to Ye Qinghuai as usual. Ye Qinghuai glanced at the list and wondered, why isn't Li Wenqing on the list? An old minister with a grey beard stepped out and replied, I report to your Majesty that Li Wenqing has contracted a cold and has taken leave yesterday. He cannot attend this hearing. He walked slowly, spoke slowly, and his figure was somewhat trembling, as if he was about to fall head-on at any moment. Ye Qinghuai squinted his eyes slightly and looked at him, asking, who will serve as the presiding judge for the imperial censorate? I will be appointed. The old man paused for a moment, as if remembering something, and bowed to Ye Qinghuai. I am the imperial censor Jiang Zongwen. I know. Mr. Jiang has been on leave for over a year now. Why did he come to court today? Thanks to the grace of the heavens, I have been doing well a few days ago. However, the imperial physician instructed me not to see the wind, which has only dragged on for a few more days. Ye Qinghuai looked at the old minister with graying hair on his temples and gave a brief smile, saying, Mr. Jiang has recovered, and Li Wenqing has fallen again. This imperial censorate is somewhat interesting, even if he gets sick, he comes in rotation. After Ye Qinghuai finished speaking, he glanced at the courtiers, wearing a black gauze hat and hanging his head motionless, as if he were a cold cicada. Ye Qinghuai scanned the silent faces of the ministers and said, if there is no memorial, let's leave the court today. Farewell to your Majesty. Ye Qinghuai briskly left the Hall of Supreme Harmony amidst the weak voice of his courtiers. As soon as she left the Hall of Supreme Harmony, she instructed Li Baoquan, who was running up, go to the Imperial Hospital to find Zhou Shi and have him immediately go to Li Wenqing's mansion to see him. Go. Li Baoquan agreed with a nod and turned around to run away again. Ye Qinghuai looked at Li Baochuan's back and felt a bad premonition in her heart. I hope I'm sensitive, she murmured to herself. Jingshou Palace, Qinxian Palace. Ye Qinghuai leaned half on the small table on the couch, flipping through a few folding books. Although she has personally taken office, there are only a dozen or so memorials sent from the cabinet every day that require her to personally approve, and most of them have been discussed and processed by the cabinet. The book in her hand was handed over by the Liezhou prefect, which was a report on the Liezhou floods and a request for government funding. It was only because the requested money exceeded the authority of the cabinet that it was sent over. Actually, delivering it to her was just a passing remark with a red stamp. If the cabinet disagrees with the request, it cannot be presented to her. Ye Qinghuai flipped over and over, but suddenly there were hurried footsteps outside the door, gradually approaching. She closed the fold in her hand and looked towards the door. Sure enough, not long after, a thin little old man appeared at the door, with two gray-white beards at the corners of his mouth, dressed in the official uniform of a hospital doctor, and carrying a square medicine box on his shoulder. Li Baoquan followed behind him, and when the person arrived, he bowed to Ye Qinghuai before exiting the door and tightly closing it. The imperial physician saw Ye Qinghuai and was about to bow, but Ye Qinghuai stood up and took 2 steps to help him. "Grandpa Zhou, there are no outsiders here, so there's no need to salute. Is Li Wenqing really sick?" Looking at the entire scene, there were only 2 people who knew that Ye Qinghuai was a woman. One was Aunt Fanghua, and the other was the skinny old man in front of him. The imperial physician Zhou Shi. After Empress Dowager Jingmin passed away, he and Ye Qinghuai were the 2 most trusted people in this world. Zhou Shi shook his head and said, "I haven't seen him. There's no one in his mansion. Not a single person." Ye Qinghuai was surprised. Zhou Shi sighed lightly and said, "There is no one in his mansion," so the old minister inquired around. The neighbors said that he was living in poverty and only married a wife. He had a son, about 5 or 6 years old, and 2 servants. A family of 5, none of them are missing. The neighbors said they heard him and his wife arguing frequently last month, and one day his wife went back to her parents' house with her son. So he's alone in Beijing. Have you heard that he's been sick recently? The neighbor said that he had seen Li Wenqing until the day before yesterday and had not found any abnormalities. Ye Qinghuai couldn't help but frown. "Your Majesty, there is another matter that I learned from the watchman." "What's going on?" Zhou Shi intentionally or unintentionally turned around and glanced at the door of the house. When he saw the door tightly closed, he lowered his voice and said to Ye Qinghuai, "The night watchman said that on the 3rd watch the night before yesterday, he saw a carriage stop in front of the Li mansion." Ye Qinghuai was taken aback and asked, "Do you see who it is?" Zhou Shi shook his head and said, "The car is covered in black cloth, and it's hard to tell where it came from." The old and young fell into silence. After a while, Ye Qinghuai seemed to have regained his usual demeanor and smiled at Zhou Shi. "Excuse me, Grandpa Zhou, for making this trip." "Don't bother." The old doctor knew that he had already reported on his business trip, bowed, and then stood up straight. With a different expression, he looked up and down at Ye Qinghuai, and his expression suddenly cooled down. "Why are you wearing so little?" Ye Qinghuai looked down at herself, wearing only a bright yellow middle coat. The winter coat was a bit hard, and she never liked to wear it, often taking it off as soon as she arrived inside. "This room is hot, I'm young, with a lot of firepower, and I can't fit through it," she said with a guilty smile as she looked at Zhou Shi's prepared scolding in his eyes. She has been most afraid of Zhou Shi since she was young, so she often gives her medication and injections. "What's the high firepower?" Zhou Shi angrily said, his beard trembling at the corner of his mouth, and Ye Qinghuai's heart also trembling. The old man frowned and said, "Ye Qinghuai is coming soon. I'll go make you a pair of warm palace soup." Upon hearing this, Ye Qinghuai's expression changed greatly. She immediately pulled off her outer robe from the hanger and put it on 3 times, 5 times out of 2. Then, she smiled at Zhou Shi and said, "Grandpa Zhou, look at me. This warm palace soup is exempt this time." Since the last time she drank it, she never wanted to drink that Lashizi warm palace soup again in her life. Zhou Shi restrained his anger and glanced at her half-heartedly, saying, "I'll have Li Baoquan add another brazier later. This room faces east, but it's still a bit cold this afternoon." Ye Qinghuai couldn't help but cry in her heart. When she heard the word brazier, she already felt herself sweating. However, with a smile on his face, he said, "Grandpa Zhou has been bothered." Zhou Shi waved his hand, stopped talking to her, and turned around to go find Li Baoquan. Li Baoquan demonstrated to Ye Qinghuai with his extraordinary actions what it means to be the imperial general. Less than half an hour later, a second brazier was lit in the small Qinxian hall. In the faint crackling sound of silver charcoal, Ye Qinghuai stared at the bright red charcoal fire and fell into contemplation. It seems that Li Wenqing is not only seriously ill this time, but also has a strange illness. Vaguely, she always felt a surge of dark waves in this seemingly peaceful palace that she couldn't see. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Joint Review. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 Joint Review. On the 16th day of the 12th lunar month, the temperature suddenly dropped. Just as dawn broke, the Dongshan Street in front of the Dali Temple was strictly guarded. Every 3 steps along the way, there were officials holding long soldiers standing straight and with a serious expression, which made people very afraid. The early vendors who set up stalls were pushed aside by government officials and gathered together to watch the excitement. "I've been setting up a stall here for over a year and haven't seen such a big battle before. It's estimated that some old master above made a mistake. Such a big battle, must it be a 3rd grade or above master? Don't listen to him talk nonsense. The war is not because of the perpetrators, but because of the judges. My nephew works as a clerk in the Dali Temple and said that the old master of the cabinet is coming to hear the case today. They were busy until midnight yesterday. Isn't your nephew selling charcoal in Changshu Square? When did he work as a servant in Dali Temple? Look at what you're saying. My nephew's job is a government job. He sells high-quality silver charcoal, which burns without any smoke and is exclusively used by the imperial court and yamen. Do you think it's the black charcoal burned in your Kong? It has blackened the walls, and even your old face has turned pale." The little old man who spoke rubbed his hands, which were slightly red from the cold and the early morning wind, but his expression was full of pride. Seeing the people around him laughing, he deliberately lowered his voice, mysteriously saying, "My nephew rubbed his hands in the cold wind, his face slightly red from the cold. I was busy until the 3rd shift before coming back. It was said that the temperature had dropped this day, and Dali Temple needed a large amount of silver wire and carbon temporarily. I heard that it was Gu Xiang who came." The expressions of the onlookers suddenly became clear. Although these street vendors cannot distinguish what a cabinet is or what position Gu Shihai holds in the court, they know that the mansion of the Gu family is the most luxurious in Xinjiang, and the carriage of the Gu family is the most magnificent in Xinjiang. Even the servants of the Gu family are 3 times more extravagant than others when they go out to buy. Under the feet of the emperor, he must be a powerful figure who covers the sky with one hand. When Ye Qinghuai arrived at the Dali Temple, it was already past Shenzhen, and the officials presiding over the trial and attending the jury were already in place. Ye Qinghuai's listening position is on the left side of the chief judge, while Gu Shihai sits on the corresponding right side. This is her first time visiting Dali Temple, and the auditorium is much smaller than she imagined, but the decoration inside is exquisite and thoughtful. Each pear blossom wood armchair is arranged as a warm chair, and a small brazier is placed in the drawer under the seat, making the entire seat warm. The tea bowl in the case contains the golden melon tribute tea from Ezhou, also known as the Ezhou Tea King. With just 1 coin, it can offset a farmer's annual harvest. Ye Qinghuai sat in the warm and comfortable seat, sniffing the aroma of tea with his nose, and couldn't help but frown. This is not Dali Temple, but rather a warm pavilion in the harem. Your Majesty, my lord and gentlemen, since the time has come, the humble minister has begun. The chief judge is Lu Wenqiu, the minister of Dali Temple. He has been sitting in this position for 5 or 6 years, and although he did not make any achievements during these 5 or 6 years, he has his own way of becoming an official. Gu Shihai turned his head and nodded impatiently, and Lu Wenxiu began the joint review of the 3 departments. After Li Wenqing went missing, Ye Qinghuai once sent palace guards to investigate his whereabouts, and received a report that he had gone home to recuperate. Ye Qinghuai asked Taiqing Pavilion to send an urgent letter to Lianghua, his hometown, to ask the local supervisor of the county, but no reply has been received so far. But Ye Qinghuai did not have any expectations for this urgent delivery. If she guessed correctly, Li Wenqing never returned to his hometown, nor even fell ill. At the feet of the emperor, where the principles of heaven are clear, there are people who can go to the streets and plunder the 4th-rank ministers of the court. Ye Qinghuai found it absurd. Therefore, she attaches great importance to this 3-company review. Li Wenqing must have known something to make some people restless, even taking risks to prevent him from participating in this review. All the answers will be revealed at this trial. The Grand Priest of Dali suddenly slapped her eyes and awakened Ye Qinghuai's thoughts. She heard Lu Wenxiu shouting with great momentum beside her, "Bring the suspect." Several figures appeared in the dazzling sunlight outside the hall. Amidst the heavy sound of iron chains, an elderly man with grey hair slowly walked towards the lobby under the escort of 2 government officials, one on the left and one on the right. The 3 of them stood against the light, unable to see clearly from a distance. Ye Qinghuai squinted her eyes slightly and unconsciously tightened the corner of her mouth. The old man hunched slightly and walked into the lobby, his face also appearing in the sunlight. Guozi face, Botzi eyes, there is a brown elderly spot under the right eye, not too dark in color. Ye Qinghuai's eyes suddenly widened, and she silently took a breath of air, feeling as if her ears were buzzing like thunder. Because she knows this face. To be precise, she knew someone from a past life. After Lu Yanchen and Ding Yu returned home in his previous life, the Taiqing Pavilion re-elected a person to be Ye Qinghuai's imperial teacher. His name is Song Zhe, born in Yizhou, at the age of 56. It is said that he was a great scholar selected from Xiangxue. However, in Ye Qinghuai's memory, he was just a sour and corrupt old man who read books and did not have much real talent and learning. He served as a teacher for Ye Qinghuai in the Wenshuan Hall for 3 months, but Ye Qinghuai felt bored and stopped attending classes. Ye Qinghuai vividly remembers his appearance. Guozi face, Botzi eyes, there is a brown elderly spot under the right eye, not too dark in color. Even though he was haggard and disheveled at the moment, with shackles on his hands and feet, Ye Qinghuai still recognized him at a glance. In the scorching gaze of the emperor's disbelief, the old man in shackles obediently knelt down and lowered his head. Wang Lisong, during the current trial of the 3 departments, the sky is clear and the sun is shining high. You must answer the questions I ask truthfully, and not conceal a word or a sentence. The court will never wrongly accuse you. Lu Wenxiu's voice was particularly majestic. Sinners, thank you for the grace of heaven. The old man finished speaking and kowtowed. However, Ye Qinghuai just stared straight at him, his gaze turning from the scorching sun to the chilly winter, as cold as today's weather. The trial in court was very smooth, and Lu Wenxiu was gentle and persuasive. Wang Lisong pleaded guilty and went to trial. Ye Qinghuai didn't hear a word. She wanted to be different. In her past life, Song Zhe, a great scholar in Xiangxue, transformed into Wang Lisong, a literary school sacrificial wine. If it weren't for someone in the past trying to be mysterious, it would be someone in this life trying to hide things from the heavens and the sea. Ye Qinghuai also had such thoughts flashing in her mind. Could it be someone in a previous life who pretended to be mysterious and sent Wang Lisong to the Wenshuan Hall in a different identity? However, this idea was quickly rejected by her. Not to mention when Song Zhe taught Ye Qinghuai in the Wenshuan Hall in his past life, Wang Lisong should have been locked up in prison. Even if Ye Qinghuai didn't notice that Wang Lisong was acquitted, the Taichin Pavilion wanted to send him to the palace to become an imperial teacher. There was no need to go to great lengths to arrange a fake identity. Moreover, based on what Ye Qinghuai has seen and heard in the past few days, if Wang Lisong dares to write books and speak frankly, criticizing the court, how could he be a mere rascal when serving as an imperial teacher? So there is only one possibility. The Wang Lisong in front of him is fake, and it is Song Zhe who has taken on the identity of offering wine to the literary school. Wang Lisong has been making sacrificial offerings at a literary school for over a decade. Despite not taking any classes on sacrificial offerings, it is impossible for him to recognize the appearance of sacrificial offerings. However, the entire interrogation was so smooth and quiet. As if kneeling there, it was the real Wang Lisong. Ye Qinghuai's corner of the eye couldn't help but tremble. The silver charcoal in the warm chair under her body was still burning, but she felt a chill in her spine. Ye Qinghuai suddenly understood why Li Wenqing would declare himself ill and refuse to attend this three-court hearing, and what prevented him from attending. Because this review was originally a grand performance, a performance for Ye Qinghuai to watch alone. In this play, except for Ye Qinghuai as the audience, everyone else is an actor. She calmly looked at the ministers in the hall one by one. Among these people, there were secondary officials of the current dynasty, ministers of the Ministry of Justice, officials of the Dali Temple, high-ranking officials of the Imperial Censorate, and high-ranking officials in the 6 ministries. Ye Qinghuai clenched her hands under her sleeves, and at some point, her palms were already covered in sweat. From her past life to this life, she has always felt that although courtiers may not be considered as very honest and upright, most of them are still loyal and exemplary pillars. Until this moment, she suddenly realized that perhaps what she had seen before was just a colorful picture, and beneath the picture was the bony truth. Now, she unintentionally lifted a corner of this painting. Fear rose in Ye Qinghuai's heart. Even when the rebels entered the city and killed themselves in their previous lives, she never had such fear. At this moment, she sat there, feeling a false spectacle behind her, and before her was a pitch-black abyss filled with a dangerous aura. She didn't know how deep the abyss was. Ye Qinghuai listened to the entire trial in a daze. Wang Lisong pleaded guilty and was dismissed from his position, exiled to Lizhou. Gu Shihai, as the second assistant of the cabinet, drafted an edict on the spot, but only Ye Qinghuai personally approved this procedure. Ye Qinghuai paused as he looked at the draft edict presented to him and said, "I haven't carried the seal with me. I'll draft it and send it to Jingshou Palace. I'll stamp the seal and then have the Taichin Pavilion issue the document." Gu Shihai looked up at Ye Qinghuai with some surprise and saw that her expression was as usual. He then lowered his head again and said, "I will take the order." End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Fairy Tales. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Fairy Tales at Night, Jingshou Palace. Ye Qinghuai was wearing a middle coat and a black satin robe outside. She sat on the collapsed edge, looking at the edict in her hand with a trance. She has been looking like this for an hour now. Fortunately, it was already late at night, and Aunt Fanghua and Li Baoquan had fallen asleep, leaving only a few eunuchs guarding outside the palace. If Aunt Fanghua and Li Baoquan are here, it's necessary to nag in her ear about taking care of the dragon's body. The edict in her hand was drafted by Gu Shihai at the Dali Temple and was sent by the cabinet in the afternoon. On it is written Wang Lisong's crime and the trial results of the 3 departments' joint trial. With only one seal from the emperor, the decision of Wang Lisong's dismissal and exile can be announced to the court and the public. She needs to stamp this seal. Even though she was well aware of how absurd this triad was. Although Ye Qinghuai has never been interested in politics, she was born into the royal family and grew up in the royal family. Over a decade of exposure and observation has cultivated her keen political acumen, and her experience of dressing up as a man and hiding things has also developed her cautious personality. The current court situation is vastly different from what she did, and what's even more frightening is that she doesn't even know how deep this pool of water is. But the situation will only be more difficult than she can imagine. Gu Shihai was able to perform a scene of pointing a deer as a horse in front of her and a group of courtiers, which shows that this court has long been surnamed Gu instead of Ye. Perhaps there are still a few loyal and outspoken officials in the court, but in the current situation, they cannot speak out, and Ye Qinghuai is unwilling to let them stand up and speak out at this time. They stood up at this moment, just adding a few, Li Wenqing. Gu Shihai's reputation in the court was established during the Renshin rebellion. In the rebellion of Renshin, the leader of the imperial army was instigated by the crown prince to launch a palace rebellion. The crown prince, under the pretext of protecting the emperor, mobilized the 9 guards of the capital to enter the palace and suppress the rebellion. The crown prince party and the crown prince party fought overnight, and in the end, all the crown prince party were executed. However, what the old emperor never expected was that the crown prince did not come to clear the emperor's side. The crown prince, who had annihilated the rebels, turned his spear and pointed his blood-stained sword at his father on the throne. If it weren't for Gu Shihai, who was then the Minister of Justice, and dozens of detectives from the Criminal Investigation Department who fought tirelessly to protect the emperor, it would have been feared that Emperor Shunping would have died by his own son's sword. Gu Shihai became famous from this battle. It is said that on that day when the sunset was stained with blood, Gu Shihai, who was over years old and not confused, stood outside the Hall of Supreme Harmony with a long sword in his hand. He was shot with several arrows and covered in blood, but he stood still like a god of war. He faced an enemy 10 times his size without fear and shouted loudly, "Eagle Nest Flying General Gu Shihai is here. If you dare to move in, you will be beheaded." He even drank the enemy for a moment, and no one dared to come forward. After the Renshin rebellion, Emperor Shunping was grateful for Gu Shihai's contributions in protecting him, and he greatly appreciated and relied on him. In just 1 year, he handed over the Ministry of Rights, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of War to him. He even appointed him as the Assistant Minister of Justice to support the young emperor during the funeral. Gu Shihai's rapid promotion can be described as a step to the sky, and no one can surpass him in the 200-year history of dying. For this secondary assistant, Ye Qinghuai has always had great trust and admiration. On the one hand, it is because of the father's recognition and trust. On the other hand, it is because the heroic spirit of Gu Shihai during the Renshin rebellion, who believed that, although millions of people have gone, I will leave, is truly lamentable. Although Ye Qinghuai is from his daughter's family, he cannot help but be impressed by his courage. So, to this day, she couldn't figure out how the great hero who sacrificed his life for justice in the past turned into a traitor who turned the tide. Is power really so scary? Ye Qinghuai couldn't help but mutter to himself. Ye Qinghuai remembered that before the death of Emperor Shunping, she had warned her that courtiers were like bowstrings, no matter how easy they were to use, they had to be replaced over time. Because power can corrode people's hearts and make them feel relaxed. She looked at the edict in her hand, every stroke of which was written by Gu Shihai, with iron paintings and silver hooks, strong and powerful, indicating that it was from the hands of a martial artist. Has Gu Shihai's heart really become relaxed? She doesn't know. Ye Qinghuai closed the edict and stood up and placed it on the desk. She doesn't plan to stamp, at least not today. She was unwilling to bow her head and retreat like this, becoming a puppet in the hands of a powerful minister, and retreating to this small space in the harem for her whole life. She wants to give herself another chance and also give the situation a chance to change. She wants to find Wang Lisong, whether alive or dead, as long as she can find him before this edict is issued, then everything can be done. But how easy is it to talk about? Wang Lisong is the crux of everything, and Gu Shihai is bound to lock him up in the most secretive place. With Ye Qinghuai's own strength, even if he digs 3 feet deep, it may be difficult to find any trace. She needs manpower. But after all, she has just taken power, and the court is mostly composed of old ministers left by her father, without her own close courtiers. Not to mention the previous dynasty, even in the harem, there were very few people she could trust. She has too few chess pieces to use in her hand. Ye Qinghuai felt a bit regretful. She wasted 2 years in office, but wasted her time without making any achievements. She even thought that the court and the people were peaceful, and that it was a situation of mutual trust between the monarch and the subjects. In fact, she is just a pet kept in the palace, and everything she sees and hears is just a fairy tale deliberately woven for her by others. That's right, if the court is truly loyal to the ruler and subjects are united, how could the Jing perish so easily? She just kept her gaze fixed on Lu Yanchen, blaming him for hating him, thinking that he had died, to the point where she didn't even notice how many hidden dangers were in the court in front of her. If the great scenery is clear and bright, with strong troops and strong horses, why fear the rebels? She remembered that before her death in her previous life, she had insisted on asking Lu Yanchen a question. In his heart, she was truly as stunned as he had written in his proclamation. And Lu Yanchen's answer was still in his ears. Since ancient times, there have been only overthrown foolish rulers and no overthrown wise rulers. Perhaps, in Lu Yanchen's eyes, at that time, he was truly a loyal and treacherous tyrant. Thinking of this, Ye Qinghuai had a somewhat absurd guess in his heart. If what Lu Yanchen said was true and he really had deep hopes for her as the emperor, then he would not have been disappointed because he saw her incompetent, and would have forced the palace to abdicate her, right? This idea just flashed by and was denied by Ye Qinghuai. What a big deal is rebellion, how could it be for such ridiculous reasons? Thinking about the origin of Lu Yanchen's rebellion, Ye Qinghuai quickly thought of another thing. In his past life, Gu Shihai also died in the hands of Lu Yanchen, and it can even be said that Gu Shihai was the trigger for Lu Yanchen's uprising. After Lu Yanchen returned to his hometown and Dingyu in his previous life, Ye Qinghuai's identity as a woman was revealed. Shortly after, news came from Yunzhou that Gu Shihai's eldest son was attacked during his regular tour of Yunzhou, and more than a dozen accompanying attendants were not able to survive. The culprit was Lu Yanchen, who was in Dingyu in Yunzhou. Lu Yanchen killed the court officials, both vertically and horizontally, and raised the anti-flag. Gu Shihai, who had lost his beloved son in pain, deeply despised him and offered several offers, but was stopped by the court officials who prioritized the overall situation. However, in the end, Lu Yanchen killed to the bottom of Xinjing city, but Gu Shihai fought hard but did not surrender, and still died in the hands of Lu Yanchen. When Ye Qinghuai saw the report sent by Yunzhou back then, his shock was like today's trial. She couldn't imagine the elegant and refined Lu Yanchen holding a knife. Not only did he take the knife, but he also killed more than 10 people in one go, the eldest son of the current court assistant. What made a learned man with no means to bind himself to the sword and commit murder? Ye Qinghuai doesn't know. But she knew that Lu Yanchen was definitely not on the same boat as Gu Shihai. The enemy of the enemy is a friend. In the matter of Gu Shihai, Lu Yanchen may be a useful person. Ye Qinghuai decided to test Lu Yanchen. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Departure from the Palace. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Departure from the Palace. The next day, Wenshuan Hall. As soon as the class started, Ye Qinghuai showed the unsealed draft edict to Lu Yanchen. Lu Yanchen's expression was calm, as if he was not surprised by the content of the edict. Sir, it doesn't seem surprising, Ye Qinghuai said. I have heard about the outcome of the joint trial of this case yesterday. What do you think of this result, sir? Ye Qinghuai finished speaking and deliberately paused before lifting his head to look at Lu Yanchen. Lu Yanchen immediately averted his gaze from Ye Qinghuai's gaze and lowered his gaze, saying, unexpectedly, within reason. Ye Qinghuai chuckled lightly and said, Mr. Wang Lisong once said that he is upright, with the ambition of a green pine tree and the demeanor of a gentleman. But from what I see, he is just a mediocre person who is greedy for life and willing to sacrifice righteousness. It is far from what Mr. Wang said, and even saying that he is like two people is not an exaggeration. Upon hearing this, Lu Yanchen raised his head to look at Ye Qinghuai. His calm eyes suddenly changed, both startled and fearful. Then, he furrowed his brows somewhat puzzled, and finally sank down again, as if he had made some decision. "Sir, I'm afraid you've taken a glance," Ye Qinghuai said again as Lu Yanchen remained silent. Lu Yanchen did not answer. After a moment of silence, he looked at the paper edict in front of him and said, "Your Majesty is saying that perhaps I have taken a glance. Since this case has been concluded, why does your Majesty refuse to add a seal?" "Because I don't believe it. I don't believe that the gentleman will take his eyes off me." Seeing Lu Yanchen's somewhat surprised expression, Ye Qinghuai curled his lips and smiled at him. "The gentleman is someone with unique insight who can see that I can be a wise ruler." When she said this, Lu Yanchen showed a somewhat helpless smile, but his gaze at Ye Qinghuai flickered with a few wisps of hope. Ye Qinghuai restrained his smile and said, "I believe in your judgment and also believe that Wang Lisong is a person of integrity. Therefore, I believe that Wang Lisong's words are insincere. The mirror of the three departments' joint review hangs high, and the world is filthy with nowhere to hide. Do you know, sir, what makes him unable to speak sincerely in the court of justice?" Ye Qinghuai's voice was not heavy, but he slowed down his pace. The teacher and student looked at each other, and Lu Yanchen's eyes couldn't conceal his appreciation. Appreciation was mixed with a third of solemnity and a third of worry. He pondered for a long time and said, "Your Majesty, have you ever heard of the old story of Lord Emo? According to legend, when Lord Emo went hunting outside the city, a praying mantis angrily raised its arm without fear. Although this move is brave, it is also foolish. Your Majesty is exceptionally intelligent and must understand the truth behind it." After a moment of contemplation, Ye Qing smiled bitterly and said, "Sir, this means that my praying mantis is a chariot that I cannot measure my own abilities." "Do I know that? But I don't want to be able to be a thread-carrying praying mantis for the rest of my life. Even if it's Lord Mo's chariot, I am willing to give it a try, and I must give it a try. I just don't know how to do it. Sir may teach me." Ye Qinghuai looked at Lu Yanchen with sincere eyes. For 3 years, it was only at this moment that Ye Qinghuai truly regarded him as a teacher to seek advice. The emperor's self-proclaimed "I" is a great courtesy. Lu Yanchen was obviously also startled, but the unexpected look on his face was only fleeting. A hint of sharpness flashed in his eyes, and the line of his jaw tightened slightly. He said, "If your Majesty has made this decision, I have 2 words to instruct your Majesty." "Sir, please speak." "One is to know oneself and the enemy, and be invincible in 100 battles. The other is to shake and destroy the enemy, and it is advisable to slowly plan for it. It's amazing that I don't even know who my opponent is now. Please clarify, sir, how to be considered as knowing oneself and the enemy." Ye Qinghuai's words were pressing step by step, as she wanted to dig out the name Gu Shihai from Lu Yanchen's mouth. However, Lu Yanchen said, "Your Majesty has forgotten what I just instructed you to do. It is advisable to slowly plan for the great destruction of the enemy." Ye Qinghuai choked on his words and couldn't help but sigh. Finally, he said, "I understand. I have taken note of your teachings." Lu Yanchen had doubts in her heart. Although Ye Qinghuai didn't know what he was concerned about, she could tell from his resolute gaze that she couldn't ask anything today. As soon as the class ended, Lu Yanchen's instructions were forgotten by Ye Qinghuai. She decided to leave the palace. She could have planned it slowly, but Wang Lisong couldn't wait that long. Although she temporarily suppressed this edict, it could not be delayed for a few days. Once the real Wang Lisong is exiled to Liezhou, it will be difficult for Ye Qinghuai to find him again. Moreover, It is unknown whether Lu Yanchen's gradual plan was based on the protection of the emperor and consideration of the overall situation, or on the strategy of delaying troops to deal with Wang Lisong. After all, he was forced to commit suicide once in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and Ye Qinghuai always kept a guard against Lu Yanchen. It was still an hour before sunset when Ye Qinghuai summoned Aunt Fanghua and told her to leave the palace in humble clothes. As expected, she was immediately opposed by Aunt Fanghua. "Why did your Majesty suddenly come up with the idea of going to the palace again?" Aunt Fanghua's head was full of excitement. "I promised to come back before dark." "Auntie, please help me," Ye Qinghuai said coquettishly, holding her sleeve. "Oh, you child." Aunt Fanghua couldn't resist her coquettishness, and her tone softened instantly. Ye Qinghuai quickly interrupted her words and said, "Auntie, this is a promise." "Auntie, remember, if anyone comes, just say that I'm feeling unwell and have already rested. If it's really not possible, ask Grandpa Zhou to come and diagnose my pulse." "Okay, okay." Aunt Fanghua responded anxiously as she tidied up Ye Qinghuai's casual clothes. "Let Commander Yen send 2 reliable experts to follow. Don't run around outside the palace. It's very dangerous outside the palace. Also, keep this safe from anyone to see." Aunt Fanghua carefully folded and wrapped the menstrual belt and stuffed it into her chest. Ye Qinghuai responded one after another. When she sorted it out properly, Li Baoquan was already waiting outside. Aunt Fanghua looked around and saw no one else except Li Baoquan. She couldn't help but look suspicious and asked Li Baoquan, "Why are you the only one?" A hint of surprise flashed across Li Bao's face, but he quickly concealed it naturally. Just as he was about to answer, Ye Qinghuai rushed in front of him and said to Aunt Fanghua, "This matter is confidential. I'll have someone else wait at the palace gate." Aunt Fanghua finally breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Your Majesty, come back earlier. The maidservant ordered the imperial kitchen to make your Majesty's favorite steamed pork." Ye Qinghuai nodded and said, "Okay. Could you please trouble my aunt in the palace?" After speaking, she took Li Baoquan to the entrance of Jingshou Palace. As soon as she left the palace gate, she gave up a seat and let Li Baoquan walk in front of her. "Has everything been arranged yet?" Ye Qinghuai asked. "If you return to your Majesty, everything has been arranged. Your Majesty's exit from the East Gate is Jinda North Street." Ye Qinghuai nodded. She was not planning to bring any guards on this trip, nor was she dressed in a dignified attire, but rather sneaked out. There were very few people she trusted in the harem, so she only notified Li Baoquan to arrange for her to secretly leave the palace. Li Baoquan was left by Emperor Shunping to Ye Qinghuai. He grew up with Emperor Shunping from a young age and once served as a loyal servant, blocking a sword for him. After all, Li Baoquan is the head of the Internal Affairs Department, and it is still easy to arrange for someone to go out unnoticed. Ye Qinghuai lowered her head and followed behind Li Baoquan, not encountering anyone along the way except for a few palace maids who were sweeping around. As the two of them walked along the palace wall to the east gate, Li Baoquan suddenly slowed down his pace and said, "Your Majesty, I am a servant. The master is acting, and I shouldn't have been talkative. But after walking this way, I always feel uneasy and want to persuade your Majesty. Let's not leave the palace. It's not peaceful outside the palace. Your Majesty's precious body should not think for himself, but also for the sake of the country. What is not outside the palace? I just need to send someone to bring it into the palace." Ye Qinghuai stopped and looked up at the towering palace wall. He let out a long sigh and said, "You can't bring what I'm looking for into the palace. No one can bring it into the palace." Li Baoquan was puzzled and said, "Your Majesty is interested in something outside the palace." Ye Qinghuai did not answer him. She withdrew her gaze and looked towards the direction facing the east gate, her expression dim and unclear. After a while, she said, "Let's go." Her every step was exceptionally firm. There is something outside the palace that cannot be brought into the palace, and no one can pick it up for her. She can only pick it up in person. That's the truth. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Truth. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Truth. Xinjing is the largest city in Kyushu. The wealth accumulated by dying for 200 years can be seen in the city of Xinjing. Yanlu painted bridge, wind curtains and green curtains, the city's pearls, and the households are full of beautiful scenery. The closer it is to the palace, the more luxurious it becomes. Ye Qinghuai looked at the magnificent scene in front of her and couldn't help but sigh in her heart. Last time she sneaked out of the palace like this, she was not the 9-5 supreme sovereign, but the 4th prince who was ignored by the court. At that time, she had only one wish in her heart, which was to grow up quickly and reach adulthood earlier, so that she could beg her father for a piece of land and leave Xinjing with her mother to live a carefree life in a border town. Who could have imagined today? Those who want the throne have earned their entire lives but have not been able to fulfill their wishes, while those who do not want it are instead adorned with yellow robes. It can be said that if you have the heart to plant flowers, they will not bloom. If you have no heart to plant willows, they will become shade. Fate is sometimes so ridiculous. Ye Qinghuai was dressed in an inconspicuous blue-gray cotton robe, shuttling through the crowds of carriages and horses. She occasionally looked up at the storefronts and attic on the roadside, observing the pedestrians passing by. Like a rural bumpkin who had just entered the city for the first time, Ye Qinghuai couldn't help but feel excited when he saw everything with a touch of novelty. This is her grand view. This is the first time since she ascended the throne that she has seen this land from such a perspective. In the small shops by the roadside, there were men drinking and chatting loudly. At the corner of the street, there were children coquettishly begging for snacks from their mothers. The street outside the restaurant was filled with the aroma of food, and the sound of reading could be faintly heard from the high-walled courtyard. Ye Qinghuai looked at everything in front of her, feeling inexplicably relieved and proud. This is her grand view. The grand scenery of clear rivers and tranquil seas. Everything is well organized, the people live and work in peace, and all industries are thriving. With this sense of relief in her arms, Ye Qinghuai walked along the road and looked. After a while, she discovered a terrible fact. She got lost. Xinjing is divided into the upper city district near Miyagi and the lower city district far away from Miyagi. The cultural school she is going to is located at the junction of the upper city district and the lower city district, passing through the upper city district from the east gate. The roads in Shangqing district were built horizontally and vertically, and were mostly large enough for 2 carriages to drive side by side. The roads were easy to find, so she didn't expect to get lost before leaving the palace. Ye Qinghuai looked at the brick and stone path in front of her, as well as the towering walls of the courtyards on both sides. The path was empty, and some of the bricks and stones on the road had already cracked, with a hint of greenery visible between the cracks. They were weeds that could withstand the harsh cold. It can be seen that this road has not been repaired for a long time. This should be the border between the upper and lower urban areas. Ye Qinghuai looked up at the direction of the sun. The sun had already set in the west, and in half an hour it would be dark. There is no one around here, she needs to find a way and ask someone for directions. Ye Qinghuai looked around and quickly walked away in a random direction. After walking for a short while and turning 3 or 2, Ye Qinghuai finally walked out of the path and entered a more spacious alley. However, the scene in this alley made Ye Qinghuai stop walking. Between the towering courtyard walls, on the cold brick ground of winter, there are beggars in rags, sitting or lying down, lifeless and disheveled, unable to distinguish between male and female, or between life and death. The entire alley is occupied by these people, without even a place to stay. Ye Qinghuai looked towards the end of the alley. At the end of the alley was a main street, where pedestrians, vehicles, and horses could be vaguely seen coming and going. The sunset slanted on the entrance of the alley, and a layer of golden afterglow was plated on the painted white corners. It was warm, but the warmth could not shine into this alley, nor onto these beggars. Ye Qinghuai calmed down and tried to squat down next to a beggar nearby. She saw that it was a woman. She leaned against the wall, leaning diagonally against a lying child next to her. Her gaze was scattered, her lips cracked, and she seemed to be taking a breath. She only had a tattered single garment on her body, which was already dirty, but her hands were still tightly holding onto the child next to her. Ye Qinghuai asked tentatively, "Madam, do you know which direction to go to the literary school?" The woman didn't respond at all, not even lifting her eyelids, as if her eyes were frozen in the cold wind of this day and earth. Ye Qinghuai asked twice again, but she still didn't respond, making Ye Qinghuai even doubt whether she had frozen to death. "It's impolite." Ye Qinghuai raised her hand and wanted to try if she still had a breath. At this moment, a small door in the alley suddenly creaked open, and a servant pushed a two-wheeled small cart out of the door. The woman next to Ye Qinghuai suddenly came to life. Her thin and weak body seemed to burst out with a powerful force, like a hunting dog, jumping up and rushing towards the small car. Not only her, but also the beggars in the entire alley suddenly came to life and rushed towards the small car, as if they were going to die if it was too late. The servant threw the small car into the alley, looked at the beggars with disdain, and then backed away, closing the door. Ye Qinghuai was startled by the woman's sudden movement, took a moment to stand up, and walked towards the alley. As she passed by the small car, she glanced inside and found a wide-mouthed wooden barrel filled with leftover food. The air was filled with the smell of alcohol and food, and there seemed to be a hint of meat. These beggars were frantically grabbing food around the wooden barrel, like wild dogs on the roadside. Ye Qinghuai saw a cold, red and black hand grab a fish bone adhered to fish meat and race it into her mouth. She suddenly experienced a fit of nausea. Ye Qinghuai ran out of the alley in 3 steps and 2 steps, and only then did she hold on to the wall and start to vomit. After she regained her breath, she looked up and saw the spacious Qianyuan Main Street. The street was bustling with the sounds of shops selling, the wheels of cars and horses, and the conversation of pedestrians. The air was filled with a faint smell of water powder, which was very pleasant. Ye Qinghuai looked up at the magnificent 3-story small building next to him, with 3 big characters inscribed on it. Bai Weiju. Originally, this is the largest restaurant in Xinjiang. Ye Qinghuai looked outside the tavern and saw an adult wearing a fur coat stepping on the back of a servant from the carriage. The servant outside immediately greeted him with a smile on his face. Ye Qinghuai was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and turned to look towards the alley. The depths of the alley were shrouded in darkness, and he could see nothing. But she knew that there were many beggars hovering on the brink of life and death, waiting at the back door of this restaurant every day, competing with each other for a bite of these adults' leftover food. A hint of sadness climbed up Ye Qinghuai's face. This is also her big picture. It is a grand view that she is unaware of, a little known aspect of this city, and the backlighting side of the prosperous grand view. The wine and meat in Zhumen smell bad, and there are frozen bones on the road. She was at the top of power, accustomed to the praises of merit and the beautiful scenery of prosperous times and peace. If it weren't for what she saw with her own eyes today, even if someone told her that there were starving people on the middle road of Xinjiang, she would never have believed it. But now, she can't help but disbelief. Under her nose, in the midst of the prosperous capital, there were still people who were unable to eat and clothe themselves. And she, sitting on a high throne, has done nothing with these people, she doesn't even know their existence. A sense of guilt accompanied by shock naturally arose in Ye Qinghuai's heart. She looked south along Qianyuan Main Street and saw a long vermilion wall at the end of the rows of eaves. It is the dying literature school, the cradle of literati and officials in the world. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Literature and Literature School. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10 Literature and Literature School. This literary school has a history of over 190 years, and the four big characters on the pillar stones in front of the door, "Literature carries the way," were personally inscribed by the founding emperor. For the past 190 years, this century-old school has continuously supplied countless pillars of the country to the Grand Court, and has also cultivated many literary giants with glorious historical records in the literary world of Kyushu. This is the holy land in the hearts of the world's officials, the ideal place for literati and literati, and the backbone and blood bank of the Grand Court. Ye Qinghuai, who grew up in the Deep Palace, had never seen the literary school with his own eyes, but he often heard its name. In her mind, the literary school should look like a scene of peach, plum, spring breeze, and 100 schools of thought contending. The campus should be filled with scenes of great scholars exchanging ideas and students arguing. Instead of the empty and bleak situation in front of us. Standing in front of the door were several heavily armored and armed soldiers, scanning the crowds with sharp expressions, creating a tense atmosphere throughout the entire campus. Ye Qinghuai looked at the leaders of several guards. He was wearing a bright light armor, wearing black leather boots, and holding a wide sword hanging from his waist with his right hand. It is the attire of the Gyeonggi Guard. The Gyeonggi Guard is under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of War and is the armed force with the strongest combat capabilities in Xinjiang. Generally, if it were not for major cases such as riots, bandits, and firearms, the Gyeonggi Guard would not be deployed. Ye Qinghuai couldn't help but frown. What big case did one school have that touched the Jingji Guard? She never heard of anything happening in the literary school when she went to court every day, and there were no clues in the documents she reported. But after a moment of contemplation, she felt that this matter was related to the case of Wang Lisong. After all, even the joint review of the three departments can turn into a big drama of turning a deer into a horse. In comparison, mobilizing the Jingji Guard is simply a small matter. Ye Qinghuai tidied up his luggage and walked to the entrance of the literary school, pretending to look inside the door. "What are you doing?" As expected, it elicited a stern question from the Gyeonggi Guard. Ye Qinghuai bowed and said, "I am an official who is going to the capital to take the imperial examination. I dare to ask Lord Jun, what's wrong with Wen Shao?" The captain walked towards Ye Qinghuai upon hearing the sound. He looked up and down at Ye Qinghuai, gesturing for the Gyeonggi Guard to retreat. He walked up to Ye Qinghuai and glanced at him again, asking, "Where is this young master from? Who is he looking for in the literary school? Do you have a reward coupon?" Ye Qinghuai took out a palm-sized wooden plaque from her arms, with her name engraved on it and a seal printed on it. She handed it to the captain of the Jingji Guard and respectfully replied, "Here is the plaque. My surname is Ye Qinghuai, and I came from the left side of the capital. This time I came to the capital for the Spring Festival entrance examination. My father once studied under the sacrificial wine gate of the Wen school, and asked me to visit the sacrificial wine master before coming to the capital." She pretended to be the name of a cousin who separated from her mother's family, and the voucher was also a genuine product printed by the government. Even if the Ministry of Revenue came, there was no problem. As expected, the captain weighed the coupon in his hand and looked at it repeatedly, saying, "He Yue." Ye Qinghuai nodded and said, "Yes. When you entered the capital, didn't you look at the notice on the city gate? The Wen school's sacrificial wine had committed a crime and has already been dismissed and punished. If you want to see him, I'm afraid you won't be able to see him." Ye Qinghuai was taken aback. Although Wang Lisong had been detained by the Ministry of Justice, the decree of conviction was still in her palace. As long as the decree was not stamped with her seal, Wang Lisong's verdict had not yet been decided, and he would still be the sacrificial wine of the literary school. But listening to the tone of the Gyeonggi Guard, it seems that they have already received the order for Wang Lisong to be dismissed. A wave of anger surged in Ye Qinghuai's heart. It seems that not only is her emperor in vain, but even the imperial jade seal in her hand has become meaningless. These people, speaking words of loyalty and filial piety, have never seen her as a monarch in the center of their eyes. The captain approached her and looked at her again, saying, "Little brother, I see that you are also a young master from a wealthy family. It's not easy for you to go to the capital to take the exam so far, so it's not good for you to go back empty-handed like this. I can tell Jijiotang that you've been here, and you've done your filial piety for your father." Ye Qinghuai didn't know what he meant by his sudden words, and couldn't help but look at him with some confusion. But seeing the captain with a greasy smile on his face, he leaned closer to Ye Qinghuai and lowered his voice, saying, "It's just that this capital is not as good as the left, everything needs to be taken care of." After speaking, he gestured a silver note to Ye Qinghuai. Only then did Ye Qinghuai understand what he meant. For a moment, many images flashed before her, including nobles in luxurious attire, beggars as skinny as a stick, and courtiers bowing their heads in silence during the trials of the three departments. She felt a surge of hot blood rush up her head, took 2 steps back, distanced herself from the captain, and scolded, "This is at the feet of the emperor, in front of the door of the sages. How dare you defy the law and demand bribes in public? Such a corruption of character. Who taught you this?" Ye Qinghuai spoke in a loud voice, which made the Jiangyi guard and passers-by around look at her. She has never been so angry before. But she also didn't know why she was angry. She was angry for the greedy face of the Jiangyi guard, and seemed to be angry for the obedience of the courtiers. She was also angry for Gu Shihai's betrayal of her and the late emperor's trust, but most importantly, she felt angry for her own ignorance and powerlessness. She wants to ask, why is this happening? Who taught them this? Several Jiangyi guards and their captain were momentarily stunned by her aura, but in the next moment, the captain immediately reacted. His face turned cold and he said, "I only gave you a clear path because I saw that you were pitiful. Since you don't know how to live or die, don't blame me for not showing mercy. Someone, take down this troublemaker." The captain of the Jiangyi guard spoke confidently and immediately regained his aura in front of Ye Qinghuai. With a wave of his hand, the 2 Jiangyi guards immediately stepped forward, one to the left and one to the right, clasping Ye Qinghuai's arms in the opposite direction and pressing her head down. Ye Qinghuai has lived for more than a decade and has never been treated so cruelly before. She couldn't help but feel angry. However, her body was thin and weak, and she was being escorted by 2 big men, completely unable to resist. Seeing the 2 of them about to drag her away, Ye Qinghuai felt anxious and couldn't help but become the first emperor to be imprisoned in the history of dying. "Do you know who I am? Tell your master to come and see me," she said as she struggled to stand on her heels amidst the drag of the Jiangyi guard. The captain of the Jiangyi guard showed no fear and instead smiled, saying, "Even if you are the heavenly king Laozi, I have the final say here. Take it with you." Ye Qinghuai never expected that the only Jingji guards could be so rampant, but it was clear that their behavior was accustomed to bullying in Xingjing City. Even if they caused trouble, they were not afraid, and there must be someone above to take care of them. Her mind was not doing well, and she was thinking of a solution in her mind. Suddenly, her shoulder relaxed, and the force that twisted against her was suddenly removed, replaced by an arm that casually rested on her shoulder. Ye Qinghuai lifted his head and saw a man who was a circle taller than him lift the 2 Jiangyi guards lightly, standing beside her and placing his hand on her shoulder. That action, with a brotherly demeanor. The man has a tall stature, a face with sharp edges and straight features. In the cold wind of the winter moon, he was only wearing a simple cloth robe, and under the robe, there were faintly visible muscles dormant with blue veins. He is a practitioner. And being able to easily remove the Jiangyi guard should be a good hand. Amidst the startled or angry gazes of the crowd, he suddenly smiled at the commander of the Jiangyi guard and said, "Don't worry about this military lord. He is my cousin. This young man has just arrived and took a wrong turn, colliding with the military lord. We have a lot of knowledge, so don't have the same opinion as him." It seems that in order to solidify his kinship with Ye Qinghuai, he also kindly patted Ye Qinghuai's shoulder. Ye Qinghuai's eyes twitched as she felt her shoulder dislocated. Aren't you just one girl? When will you have a cousin? The captain obviously knew him, but frowned and asked in a tone. I just came to the capital, the man said, leaned over to the captain, took out a few silver coins from his arms, and stuffed them into his collar. With a smile on his face, he said, let Liang Team and the brothers take care of themselves. It's worth it. Let me treat the brothers to a drink. The captain took out the few silver coins from his arms and counted them, seeming to feel a bit scarce, but he looked up and bumped into the man's smiling face. Without hitting the smiling man, he glanced at Ye Qinghuai again, with a face full of words, I'll give you a discount today. Then he turned to the man and said, even if it's for your face today, go back and teach him the rules well. After speaking, he threw back Ye Qinghuai's coupon to the man and turned around with his men to leave. The crowd of onlookers quickly dispersed, leaving only Ye Qinghuai and the tall man in front of the door. Ye Qinghuai looked cautiously at the man and asked, who are you? I'm your brother, how come I turn my face and don't recognize anyone? He finished speaking, then leaned on Ye Qinghuai's shoulder and lowered his voice, this is not the place to talk. Aren't you looking for sacrificial wine? Come with me. End of this chapter.